Tonight I'm talking to a fantasy and science fiction writer, steampunk writer, living in New South Wales, who has been an academic, performance artist and writer, publishing 15 full-length works of fiction, 3 academic books, short stories and poems. He's won the Aurealis Award at least 5 times and the A. Bertrand Chandler Award for Outstanding Achievement last year. Welcome, Richard Harland.
Hi, Nalini.
Hi. Now, your aspirations to write started very young.
Yes, when I was 11 years old I got the idea that I would love to be a writer, and it was a few years later when I started taking it seriously, and I went off completely on the wrong track because my talent, if I could say I've got talent, is for telling exciting stories that draw people in, that are hard to put down, using my imagination, whereas I decided that I ought to be writing literary stories, and I knew how to do it. I mean, you know, I could do clever imitations, but it's not actually true to what I am, and so I was basically cheating on myself. And I got writer's block for 25 years.
That's quite a block.
Yeah. I think that's a Guinness World Book of Records, block that one.
But you got past it.
I did in the end. It took a long while. I never gave up. I mean, I can say the positive thing about myself is that I never gave up trying. And yeah, I've still got 30 unfinished novels in a cupboard back at home.
30?
30. Some of them were nearly finished. But, you know, I kept on going. I never gave up, and I think that says something good about me, along with all the things I've done wrong. That says something good.
Well, it says that you keep going.
Yeah, I think every writer has to think like that. Persistence is a big part of the game.
Yes.
I did a number of things wrong, like not showing my work to other people, like being a perfectionist instead of simply practicing getting stuff done and hearing what other people thought of it. And trying to write the wrong sort of fiction.
Yes, well, I must admit, I'm quite glad that you're into steampunk and not literature, because literature with a big L.
Yeah, well, I used to teach literature. I mean, when I was suffering from writer's block, I got to be a university lecturer at Wollongong, and I used to teach literature, and I still value a lot of literature. I love a lot of literature, but I don't know that I'm very excited by where it's got to at the present. I just think it's kind of lost its way, whereas fantasy and science fiction and steampunk are kind of new growing places where important stuff can still happen, where telling stories still matters. I mean, it's so basic, telling stories, the appeal of hearing a story. And when I do school visits, I always do readings, and kids love hearing a reading of a story.
Yes.
Basic thing.
Yeah. And what age groups are you speaking to when you're doing these school tours?
All through high school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're visiting a few high schools at the moment?
I am indeed. I'm in Victoria. I'm pretty well doing 1 or 2 high schools every day for 3 weeks. Yeah, okay. It's a bit exhausting. I love the part of doing the talks, of doing the presentations. I mean, I'm a bit of a performer. I like doing that. I just don't like living in motels and travelling around and everything else that goes with it.
So you're a bit of a performer. That kind of helps to explain the costume.
Yeah, costume does help. I mean, I like dressing up anyway. And I think I share that with my wife. We both love fancy dress type things, but yeah, I think everyone is helped to perform beyond themselves by dressing up a bit. I found that when I was tutoring at New South Wales University in drama, get a student to wear a hat or a scarf or just a jacket or anything, just something to make them different, and they can start leaving themselves behind. And that's what you've got to do. You've got to, you know, not be inhibited, not to be self-conscious.
Yes, you're putting on a mask when you put on this piece of costume.
Yeah, well, you're opening up something in yourself that is not what you would normally reveal. Yeah.
So what do you think you open up with your costume?
People are always saying that I'm a very enthusiastic presenter, and I mean that's not actually a costume thing. That was when I was a lecturer too. I don't know. I suppose I'm a rather retiring kind of person. A lot of my life, put on a costume or put me on stage, and I can get very, very carried away.
I remember seeing you quite animated on a few panels at Continuum.
Ah, yes, well, I do like panels. That's kind of going back to university days, which I still miss the stimulation of bouncing ideas around. So after months and months and months of just hermiting away and writing all by myself, it's actually like this dam burst, and all this kind of some mental energy is just waiting to rush out in the form of knocking ideas around and discussing things, because it's very hard to discuss writing with people. I mean, I can share it with other writers. I can't even share it with my wife, because you need to be a writer to understand what it's like to, I don't know, to have a bad day, to have trouble with a character, to be frustrated with a plot line or something. All of those things every writer experiences in their own way, but nonetheless you do understand each other's experience.
Yeah.
We're a funny lot.
Yes. You've taught courses on fantasy and speculative fiction, not just literature, while you were building up to writing yourself.
Oh yes, I mean, I managed to get those courses onto the curriculum, so yeah, I really enjoyed doing that. I mean, I put it like this, I enjoy talking about fantasy and spec fic. I don't think that actually has any much impact on my writing. I don't think I can talk about it kind of after the event, like I can look at a book, back on a book of mine and say things about it, but when I'm actually writing it, I'm immersed in the world and the story, and any sort of conceptualisation of that kind is a million miles away. So it's almost like I've got two halves of my head, like one half is still the analytic kind. I mean, I as you said, I had academic books published and they're pretty abstract, whereas the books I write in a fictional way, everyone says they're like watching a movie. They're very sort of visual and concrete. So, it's like, I don't know how these two halves fit together, but they're both in the same skull.
Yes, I can totally see Song of the Slums being made into a movie. Absolutely.
So, Spielberg, pay attention.
Yeah, you said before you were a late starter. You didn't start getting published until you were 45.
I didn't start finishing things till I was 45, Nalini. I mean, I was actually very lucky in the way when I did finish books, I moved very rapidly into, first of all, a small press publication, and then scoring mainstream publication. So it happened pretty fast when I managed to kind of do the necessary and actually finish a book.
But do you think those years of trying have helped you, I don't know, build up a reservoir? Because you've published a lot of work since then.
I think I'm not going to run out of ideas. I mean, I'm aiming to live till about 100. I might start kind of, I've got an awful stockpile of ideas just waiting to go, and yeah, that's the one good thing about writer's block is, the ideas are still there. But I don't know, I mean, to some extent the writer's block period was silly, and I think in some ways I wasted a lot of time that I could have put to profitable use. But at the same time, yes, I was learning, just in not a very sensible way of learning, to kind of be tearing your hair out and frustrated all the time. But I guess when I did manage to finish a novel, it was because it finally lived up to my own ridiculously perfectionist standards. So I felt good about it for the first time, and now I feel good every time I finish a novel. Now it's almost like a blessing to be able to, success and sort of, overseas contracts and all those things. They're all great, but actually just finishing a novel is like a reward.
I actually felt that Song of the Slums was a feel-good novel as well.
In a way, it is. It's sort of an inspiriting, inspiring type story. I mean, it is a success story, and I wanted to write a success story. But I didn't want to make it a simple success story. I think of it as kind of, well, I mean, because I have played music on stage. In the period when I was suffering from my writer's block, I played folk rock music around Sydney. It's not that far from rock music, and the same, you can build on the same experiences. The sort of buzz of bouncing off other musicians on stage, the incredible high when the audience is with you, you can feel the vibe coming off them. I mean, it really is quite euphoric, and I wanted that to be in the novel, and I think from all the feedback I've heard, it is in the novel.
Oh yeah.
Great. But I also wanted to show that it's not being famous, being a success as a performer, isn't like The Voice or X Factor, or there are complications. Yeah. Life is not as simple as that, and I did want that to come in too. So I think of it as a bit of a critique of the sort of simple belief in fame and success. What they achieve in the end, what the band achieves in the end, isn't quite what they started out wanting to achieve. It's a mega success, but it's a slightly, I don't know, more socially useful success, perhaps.
Yes, it wasn't a success for the sake of it.
No.
After you started publishing late, you've won lots of awards.
I've won a fair few Aurealises. 6 actually, and I've won the Tam Tam Jabouquin Award in France, which sounds like a chocolate biscuit or something. It's actually quite a prestigious award, quite important. I mean, it was important enough for my French publisher to fly me over to Paris on the strength of it. And the Bertrand Chandler Award. So yes, I've won some awards along the way, and it's nice to feel that people in the spec fic and fantasy community respect my writing. That matters too. And yeah, book sales are nice, awards are nice, all of those things are very, very nice, and I guess I feel I'm incredibly lucky to have a dream coming true that, well, it was sort of dormant and bubbling away under the surface, frustrated for all those many, many years.
Do you think winning the awards has put pressure on you?
No.
Yeah?
No. I mean, I haven't won the Man Booker or anything. I think that might sort of do it, but I'm saving that up till I'm about 99.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, when you published your first novel, you had an unbelievable piece of luck. Yeah.
I brought out Vicar of Morganville with a small press, and that means really small. It's actually a community of authors, so it's kind of just one tiny step up from self-publishing. And it was reviewed in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian, which is a miracle in itself. I don't think they would review small press books nowadays. And the reviews were so glowing, I just wrote to say thank you to the reviewers, just like how you made me feel so good with those reviews. And Van Eycken of the Sydney Morning Herald wrote back and said, really liked your book. If you've got another manuscript, send it my way and I'll see if I can recommend it to a mainstream publisher. Wow. That is about like 500,000 to 1. That just does not happen. Reviewers are very, very busy people, and they have to read more books already than they want to, so they're not inclined to do things like that. So that was unique. I've never heard any other writer with that story.
You took a leap of faith and left your day job.
Yes, I took a leap of faith particularly because I didn't know not so much whether I would keep getting published, but even whether I would keep on being able to finish books, whether I'd escape from writer's block for good, or whether I'd fall into it again and get stuck. And it hurt because I really did enjoy being a university lecturer and doing the tutoring. I just enjoyed that kind of interaction, and I had tenure, and I knew that the way the hiring was going at that time, if I resigned, I wouldn't get a university job back like that again. Yeah. So it was, I guess sometimes you just have to follow the dream, don't you? I mean, I couldn't have borne to spend the rest of my life not knowing if I could have made it or not. Yeah.
Yeah, so you took a risk and it's paid off.
Yeah.
And you're another author who's dreamt a novel and then written it.
Well, that sort of applies to World Shaker. It kind of applies to Ferren and the Angel. I do use dreams a lot. I mean, those are probably the ones that I would mention because the whole germ of the novel came out of a dream. a lot of other novels have bits of dream material in. I'm just lucky. I've always had long, vivid dreams, a bit like movies, and I've got into the habit of writing them down. And yeah, it's just a trick. When you wake up, you make notes, and like you can go back to sleep again. But in the morning, you will remember what the dream was. And I've got an awful lot of dream material available for use. So it's kind of handy, for an author to have that as a given, as a starting point.
So you've got more dream journals that you can draw on?
Oh yeah. Trouble is, Nalini, my dreams nowadays have gone downhill. I'm starting to have really boring dreams about shopping in the supermarket and things like that. It's just as well I've got a backlog.
Yeah. You talk about your brain being divided into analytical and creative portions. How does that work for you?
Basically, like doing two different kinds of things. I don't see any. Maybe there is a connection between them, but it's not very obvious to me anyway. I just, I suppose at the moment I've left the analytical side behind. I mean, when I was a university lecturer, I did also publish some books, and some of those books had what I think of as important ideas in them. I did have some things I really wanted to communicate. That's actually why it was easier to resign the lectureship, because I'd kind of said what I wanted to say.
So you had a certain amount that you needed to get done in that role, and you achieved that, so then you could let that go and move on and follow a different dream.
And that in itself is a little, I mean, my whole life seems to be this huge looping process. So I had the idea I wanted to be a writer when I was 11, and here I finally looped back round to it. But I had, when I first came to Australia, I had a PhD thesis which had, I felt, some really important ideas in it. And I changed from that thesis to something more manageable, and then I failed to finish another thesis, and like it was many, many years later before I did finish a thesis, and the sequel to that thesis was actually the book that I had first originally wanted to write, that I could now work out. So yeah, maybe if you stick in there, things get realised in the end.
Yeah.
I look at my life as having a whole wasteland period, but nothing is really wasted. So I mean, even Song of the Slums. I mean, like the period I spent playing folk rock music, that is exactly the experience I can draw on in writing Song of the Slums.
Yeah. We keep going back to Song of the Slums, and we'll come back to it again. One of the questions I've been dying to ask you is, in the 80s, well, probably other periods as well, but particularly in the 80s, I remember, like down at Salamanca Market in Hobart, people would be using junk, like juice bottles and stuff like that, to make music. And it was all like jam sessions, people coming and going.
I can remember when rock and roll first started up, and I was still in England at that time, and skiffle bands were all the rage, which was basically homemade instruments.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
wow.
Yeah. There is something satisfying about that sort of I don't know, I mean, this is me in general. Give me something that needs patching up with Band-Aid and rubber bands and paper clips, and I'm brilliant. Expect me to do an actual proper job of repairing anything or anything seriously kind of mechanical, and I'm hopeless.
So the costumes in Song of the Slums were actually you doing sewing?
Doing something?
Doing sewing. Like your costume design, because you're talking about how it was all patchy and people had like knitted different things together and they'd been really creative.
That seems to me the way that I envisage the slum people. I mean, that seems to me the way they would dress there. Again, it's sort of like, it's the Victorian period, but it's not sticking to the Victorian period, it's a fantasy version, and that's kind of one of the things I like playing around with, sort of other kinds of clothes that people might have worn, and still getting an old-fashioned feel to it, but in a sort of an odd, incongruous way.
Have you received any fan art based on the costumes in the book?
No. It's only been out since the beginning of this month, so
I suppose
a bit soon.
Well, if you get any, I'd love to see it, because I find that really inspiring. Editing and revisions. What experiences have you had with editing?
Well, I've actually been pretty lucky. I've almost entirely worked with editors that I greatly respect. Having been an academic, where you finish articles or books and people don't muck around with them, I was also a poet. I've got quite a lot of, no, I got a small number of poems published, but they were in prestigious magazines. People don't muck around with that. So I wasn't really prepared to have people telling me, this needs doing better. So I was a nightmare to begin with when I was first with Pan Macmillan. I was asked to do some really quite small revisions on the first novel, The Dark Edge, and I dug my heels in and made a fuss and made a fight, and God knows why they kept on with me. But I did sort of learn from that, and gradually I've gone from one extreme to the other. From being the world's worst reviser, I think I am now almost a role model of how to do revision, which is I sort of take in suggestions. I go out looking for suggestions. I show my manuscripts to 10 sample readers outside of editors, because editors don't quite read the same as ordinary people. So no. I like to get a bit of a mix of reactions, and I kind of take that on board and sort of think about what could be done better and make it my own. I think that's the key thing. I mean, if you're just revising because someone tells you to, then it's never going to be very convincing. I can actually pick it up in novels where I can see, this chunk has been revised. It's sort of like, it's not thought through, whereas when I revise I start at page 1 and go all the way through to the last page, and every change kind of flows through to everything else further along the line. Yep. So I actually enjoy it. In a funny kind of way, it's like a challenge. I've gone from hating any kind of revision to actually sort of enjoying almost... I guess one of the things about writing is that you have to believe when you write it that that is exactly the way it happened. I mean, you've got to have total conviction, and you've got to sort of be sure that this is exactly how it happened. And then further down the track, someone suggests, but that's not quite working. And you have to go back and think, well, maybe it could have happened in a different way, and you have to sort of unpick it, which is hard to do. That's why it helped. I mean, I couldn't do it instantly. I needed at least a couple of months to start rethinking. But I can do that now, and to see that things could have happened in a different way, and then make it solid and real all over again.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I remember one particular novel, not an Australian author, where someone had obviously done a revision, and this little bit was changed here, which actually preempted this little bit that introduced that. So obviously there were a couple of changes, but it was out of sequence. Yeah,
and it doesn't help. I mean, as I say, I've been very lucky with editors, and I've got a huge respect for editors, because how they can manage to keep reading stuff over and still bring a fresh mind to it is beyond me. But the one thing that editors do wrong is they will always say to you, actually, we think there are some things that could be revised, but they're really, really tiny revisions. And what they ought to say is they are absolutely monster, huge revisions, so that when you look at them, they actually seem more manageable.
Now there's an interesting thought.
Reverse psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. How important is the editing process and your relationship with your editor?
Very, very. I mean, and at the moment, because I'm being published in various countries, I get a number of different sort of editorial kinds of feedback, and it's not the same. I mean, editors probably tend to believe that they would all say the same things, but that's not true. They don't. And sometimes it feels like, I mean, for Liberator, I deliberately made a point of getting the UK and the American and the French and German and all of the different suggestions together. And it was like having my head in a cage of parrots. I mean, it was just like everything seemed to be flying off in all directions, until I got to the stage of thinking, like, this is what I would like to do. And when I sort of worked out my kind of drive to take through it, a lot of the things that had been thrown at me kind of fell into place. And I could see that they would work in rather nicely with the new thrust, not a single new thrust, but just a kind of an overall rethink that was mine. And yeah, I've had some very good editors, the kind of editors that you listen to even for creative suggestions, because they're enough. The worst kind of editor, I imagine, would be someone who's not really in sympathy with what you're doing, and that would be disaster. Or someone who's in sympathy will always have valuable things to say, and sometimes, the thing is, they may get something completely wrong. They may say, look, you've sort of this was wonderful. You've this Song of the Slums actually. You've missed out a day here. It's 3 days and it should be 4. And I can check back and prove that actually I got it right. But the fact that the editor was baffled by it almost certainly means that I haven't been clear enough about it. I was doing something wrong because it miscommunicated.
Yeah.
So it's for me to put that right rather than for me to just say, no, I was correct all along and you were wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So either way, there was
You
some
learn one way or another.
Yeah. With regards to the Liberator and having the different countries or the editors from the different countries input, did you end up with one edition for everybody, or did you end up with different twists in the story for different countries?
It's pretty much the one edition. America does have a bit of a difference, which goes back to a difference in World Shaker, to do with the infant there, and that was different because America came in. You know, it was sold and revised to Australia before it sold overseas. So America came in later there, and I mean, my Sun Manchester editors were very good. Americans in general are much more interventionist. That's a nice way of putting it. I mean, they will normally sort of like they're even more brusque about it. I mean, Australian editors are very tactful about look, maybe you could think, is this maybe some way of? Whereas Americans are more inclined to say, this doesn't work, change it.
Yes, right.
It comes to the same thing in the end, but you know.
Yeah, but there are ways of phrasing it, and yes. Can you tell me, you know, like a short explanation of steampunk, the genre, and a bit about your steampunk novels? I mean, we've already been talking about them, but yeah.
We haven't talked about steampunk as such. I think of steampunk as an alternative fantasy version of the 19th century, whether it's kind of set in an alternative 19th century or whether it's a future world that looks 19th century-ish, in the same way that traditional fantasy basically goes back to the Middle Ages, people on horseback, people fighting with swords, and does a fantasy version of that. Steampunk goes back to the first industrial age, meaning the time between the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 1700s and the advent of the new forms of industrial production, like plastics and chemicals and use of major use of electricity and internal combustion engine, which come in sort of around World War I before and sort of during. So that's kind of the period, the first big period of machines. So you can use, for me it was like a liberation, to actually be able to imagine machine possibilities instead of just castles and woods and forests and things. I also like the politics of that age, because it is really our first political age. I mean, I would say that the sort of three things that come together at the end of the 1700s are the Industrial Revolution and the French and American revolutions, which gave us our political way of thinking. People hadn't quite thought politically in that way before. And also the Romantic Revolution, which conveniently for me ties in with sort of the sort of darker Gothic-y elements in my writing. But yeah, I like politics that it makes a break from kings and queens and palace intrigues and so on, which I love, but there's been an awful lot of them, and I like politics that it relates to our age more directly, but it's that much more raw, because this is when politics was being formed, when people died for their politics, when revolutions were you know, not just going around and polling what people's opinions were, when people actually died in the streets and set up barricades. So it's kind of, it's a more raw and exciting kind of politics, but it also is in some ways closer to where we are now, and you can draw a lot of interesting parallels while keeping them much more exciting than current day politics is.
Well, one of the things that I kind of noticed in Song of the Slums is that in some ways it was political and economical, but you had the advantage of not referring to modern day political parties, the way you're discussing even politics, you're discussing it in terms of the outcomes of what people are doing and the impact on other people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what a novelist does, isn't it? I mean, you personalise things, so that you put someone in their position. Often you kind of slightly underplay the role of mass movements, but nonetheless you can still show a mass movement and tie it in with individuals. And yes, I mean that puts you there in the situation. That makes you take sides or care. And really, that's what it's all about. I mean, that's, I suppose, the problem with modern politics, is that most people don't care that much anymore.
2 years ago, you were on a panel about Australian steampunk.
I never finished talking about steampunk, did I? Maybe I should. I finish?
Maybe you should.
Yeah,
yes.
I sort of got sidetracked.
We kept getting back to the Song of the Slums.
Yeah, well, that's good. I like that, because that's the one I've just brought out. But so steampunk, I think of as the sort of fancy version of the industrial age, and it's obviously inventing machines.
Yes.
It's also, I like the fact that the Victorian age, something appeals to me about the Victorian age. I have this theory, which is only a theory, it may be total garbage, but I have the theory that there are some periods of the human imagination that resonate through the ages. And like the Middle Ages, period of the Arthurian legends. It's not the reality of the Middle Ages, it's the way they imagined themselves. And I think there's something the same in the 19th century, in the Victorian age. The way that, I mean, it's, you know, you think of the 19th century, you think of sort of Jekyll and Hyde and sort of Jack the Ripper and all those sort of... It's sort of... Prejudice? Well, no, I think of Pride and Prejudice actually, although I know it was written in the 19th century, it actually belongs more to the 18th century in spirit. But maybe it fits in too. But to me, I mean, it's personal preference. I like the dark and gothic side, and I think of like the end of the 1700s was when the Gothic Revolution took place, when all the sort of great first outpouring of stories about ghosts and sort of dark things and castles and all of that came out. And I think it moved on by the time of people like Dickens into urban Gothic. That is, finding the same sort of qualities, the same sort of fog and claustrophobia and all of those qualities in an urban setting. And they I mean, the way Dickens imagined London is not how London actually was in the 19th century, but there's something very persuasive about it. There's something that kind of still echoes and resonates for us. So I think of myself as following in the footsteps of that form of imagination, just as, say, Tolkien follows in the footsteps of the Middle Ages imagination.
Yeah, and you are very urban in your writing.
I think I'm not alone in that. I think quite a lot of fantasy writers have got a little bit tired of Greenwoods and the sort of pastoral type stuff. And there's the whole movement of the new weird with China Mieville and company, who look for urban settings, enjoy urban settings. I mean, it's no good just doing urban settings. You've got to find something about them. You've got to find atmospheres in them and qualities and feelings that you know, appeal to the imagination. And for me, I like imagining urban settings.
Yeah, well, for me, I've lived in the country, and it's a great place to visit. Wouldn't want to live there. There's so much more in the city, and I think the same can be true for literature. Like if you're using an urban setting, there's just so much more.
Well, I hope that the scenes where Astor and Verrill come to London, the sort of sheer amazingness of being in a capital for the first time, everything sort of strange, different, exciting, wonderful, almost superhuman. Yeah, we've probably all experienced that, haven't we, somewhere along the way? Well, anyone who started out in the country like me, Haynes.
Yes, well, I remember when I was a kid talking about Hobart being the big smoke. Here I am in Melbourne. 2 years ago, you were on a panel about Australian steampunk, where people said Australia didn't really have an industrial 19th century. Do you have anything to say to that?
It's true, but that doesn't mean there can't be Australian steampunk. I mean, you can import things into Australia because it is a fantasy version, so you can do that. I'd like to sort of spread the term steampunk as widely as possible. I mean, I I can say that there are some qualities that tend to keep recurring in books that we call steampunk. But there's an awful lot of really great books that sort of have some of those qualities but not others. And I mean, Australian steampunk might, for instance, have wonderful gadgets. You can certainly imagine wonderful gadgets in 19th century Australia without necessarily having a sort of a smoky London-like urban setting. So you could have some things and not others.
In some ways, I think Australia's the ideal fantasy setting because we've got everything here now.
Well, it's funny that, I mean, Australia has done very well in terms of fantasy writers. Our fantasy writers punch way above their weight internationally. And you would say, you know, Australia, modern country, doesn't really have much past, so why? And I'm not going to answer that one because I don't know the answer, it just seems true.
Yeah. When we spoke last time, a couple of years ago, you said that it's necessary to settle into a particular genre. Why is that?
Did I? Yes.
You did. It's come back to haunt you.
It's come back to haunt me, and I'm still in the same genre, and I guess I'm happy because steampunk is what I always really wanted to write. Well, I think
even before it was steampunk, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, my planning for Worldshaker predates the starting to write it by 10 years, and starting to write it predates the publication by 5 years. So it was, I didn't know it was called. Well, I could have thought about it and decided that yes, I could count this as steampunk, but I didn't at the time.
You were ahead of your time.
Yeah, I know. That is the trouble actually about being an Australian author, is that in America they can run with niche markets and sort of, you know, make their money. Whereas in Australian publishing, because we're a much smaller market, you can't really afford to do anything way out on a limb. It's too much risk. It helps if people picking up a Richard Harland book know the kind of book they're going to be getting. And I guess through all my writing career until the last 3 books, I like jumping around from one thing to another. It's good for the imagination to sort of like to move on to something different, and you always come back again afterwards. But it's not that sensible in terms of building up a reputation. You really need to do more of the same but different. That hardest thing. I mean, that's what everyone wants, and that's why so many fantasy series run themselves into the ground, because people want more of the same and more of the same and more of the. I mean, it's not simply publishers. Publishers only want it because readers want it, and readers do want more of the same. And it's difficult to do more of the same and yet be different and new and fresh over and over again. And yes, I mean, to me that was one of the great things about the Harry Potter books. Certainly all the early ones kept on doing something new, even though it's a very sort of regularised formula in a way. It kept on doing something new. And that's hard, and unfortunately a lot of writers don't realise when they just can't think up anything new anymore. So yeah, I'm happy with steampunk at the moment. I don't know that I'm always going to be writing steampunk. Well,
some of your colleagues, like Marianne de Pierres, for example, writes across genres, so she's writing fantasy and she's writing crime and she's writing science fiction. Do you think you might be incorporating facets of other genres into steampunk?
I suppose with what I've done so far, I'm incorporating facets of other genres into steampunk. I mean, Song of the Slums is much more of a romance than anything else I've written. I mean, that's partly because the romance in between Colin Riff in Worldshaker and Liberator kind of took off and worked so well, and you know, people were quite taken with it. So I thought, I want to do more of this. I always wanted to do more of it, so I decided I'm going to do more of it. Song of the Slums is a success story in a way that's Liberator and Worldshaker aren't. I mean, I'm doing something different. People have sort of called it gaslight romance. Steampunk meaning the overarching term, but Song of the Slums has less emphasis on the machinery and more on the relationships and the characters. So that's under really the umbrella of steampunk. Jumping out to another genre again, no. I don't know. That's sort of common sense would say I've got to write more in the same vein, but I don't know. creative impulse, doesn't it? I mean, even Song of the Slums was almost an accident, because after doing World Shaker and Liberator, I thought we're going to need another one in the series. So I planned the Juggernauts going to America and things that would happen there, and the story kind of kept getting a little bit overcomplicated. That's a bad sign. It means that I haven't got a single clear vision that's kind of taking command. And instead I was drawn to playing around with this idea of rock and roll being invented 100 years before Elvis Presley, and an earlier period in the whole world, this whole steampunk world I'd created. And I just kept on developing it, and kind of in the end it turned out that my publisher actually preferred the Song of the Slums rock and roll story to a sequel to Liberator. So sometimes my creative imagination goes the way it should do, yeah.
Sometimes the magic works. We've kind of touched on the next question. The next question I have written down is, your latest novel, Song of the Slums, is about a band. It felt like you were writing what you know. Have you been in a band? I think you answered that one already.
I suppose, I mean, like, just to elaborate on it, the band that I was in was not particularly successful. We had a few magic nights when everything just came together, and it was really wonderful. But the thing is that you don't actually need to have that to write about it. You just need a little piece, and you can imagine all the rest.
Yes.
So we never had success like the Varieties have in Song of the Slums, but just a tiny little bit of success. You can kind of expand on it and build it up to mega success, which is what they achieve.
Yes. Yeah, those nights where the crowd gives you good energy and you get more energy, and then the crowd gives more energy. And,
exactly. It's a great feeling.
Do you have anything to say to people who want to write but have experienced frustration along the way?
Well, if they're suffering from writer's block, I could write a book. I mean, there's the frustration of not being able to get published, and that's really... all I can say is persistence, just keep on trying. I mean, it's really a matter of getting the slots lined up. You've got to have written the kind of book that the publisher thinks there's a market for in that moment. And, I mean, if you're trying to follow trends, you're always going to be too late. I mean, you know, anyone that's trying to write vampire novels now is missed by about 5-10 years, because publishers jumped on that. They were getting their staple of authors together ages and ages ago. So you've just got to write the best book that you have in you, and hope that the best book you have in you will coincide with what people are looking for. I mean, that's sort of the story of World Shaker and my steampunk writing. I just really developed the World Shaker world as a kind of hobby for 10 years, and I didn't know that it was going to start in a new surge of popularity for steampunk, and it just fell into place for me.
Tell us how you got your crystal ball out.
No, I didn't. I was really kind of like, I was totally on my own, and I thought no one's ever going to like this stuff. But anyway, I wanted to just play with it for my own sake, and yeah, the world turned and came round the way I wanted. So yes, you've got to look at it like that. I mean, you can write the best novel in the world. It's not going to get published unless a publisher actually thinks there's a market for it at that time. I need a writer writing this sort of stuff at this moment. So you've just got to accept that, and sheer quality alone won't do it. Unfortunately, you've also got to have the timing right. And in terms of writer's block, do the things that I didn't do. Show your work to other people. Work every day with a regular writing routine. Don't wait to be inspired, because the inspiration will always run further away when you wait for it. Just start writing and the inspiration will come. Have a routine that just goes on day after day after day. Don't expect it to be exciting day after day after day. Just the novel is bigger than you are, and if it's working, it will write itself through you eventually. And don't panic. Don't feel guilty. Was my big mistake when I started getting stuck again. I thought, oh no, it's happening again. It's all, you know, and I just felt it was all me. It was all my fault, my lack of will and my lack of drive to push it through. Whereas now I look back at the sort of 30-odd unfinished novels I've got in the bottom of the cupboard, and I think I've reread some of them and think, there's great things in them, but actually there were always flaws in them too. None of them I wouldn't want to publish any of them now. And I guess, you know, sometimes the novel is trying to tell you something. So you just have to be learning how to listen to what it's saying and be prepared to go back and rethink. One of the, if there's anything I've learnt with my 17 novels, it is how to set up a novel earlier on, so that I can sort of, I've got a better sense without having to actually plan it out. I do a lot of planning, but this is more like a gut instinct thing, that it's going to work out in a way that I want. It's sort of like a feeling of where it's going and how to avoid problems before they arise. And you do learn that with practice. And I guess that is maybe my ultimate advice to anyone with writer's block is just practice. Get stuff written, show it to people, learn what they think about it, and keep on and on and on, because you know, that is, you learn from practice more than anything. I kind of, this is perfectionism, so I wanted it to be perfect, and of course you can't do that straight out. Kind of obvious really, but it took a long while learning it.
Yeah. You've put up a website with free writing tips. What motivated you to go to such lengths?
I know, it was 4 months out of my writing time that was a huge investment. It ran away from me, but it started when I was at a literary luncheon, book feast, and some students who'd been doing their creative writing extension to English in New South Wales came to me and said, we read your writing tips on your author website, and they were really, really helpful, and they were sort of quite enthusiastic about it. And I thought, hang on a sec, they're talking about like 8 or 9 pages of stuff that I just produced off the top of my head. I mean, I didn't even think about it much at the time. If that helped you, I could do what would really help you. And I started into it, and as I say, it totally ran away from me. But on the other hand, I've always thought that when I finished the writing tips guide, and it was finally up on the web almost the very next day, I got the notification from my agent that Simon & Schuster in America had offered an advance for World Shaker that was worth more than all my previous 40 novels put together. So I always thought, there is karma there. Someone is kind of like dealing out the cards in a very fair way.
Wow! Yeah, so you felt like you were rewarded.
I felt like I was being rewarded. And I felt I could do it. I mean, I suppose I did it in a sense because I could do it. The two halves of my head again. The side that actually does the writing, but the other side that can kind of stand back and look at what's going on. And having had that writer's block for so very, very long, in some ways I can see things. If you just do things straight away without thinking about them, then you're lucky. But I had to actually do quite a bit of thinking to get myself over a whole lot of hurdles before I could write successfully. So I have that advantage in terms of being able to offer advice to people. Anyway, the advice seems to have been very helpful. I've got a lot of great feedback from the site, so I feel I did do something really good there.
That's great.
Probably the best, but the most sort of self-sacrificing, noble thing ever in my life.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm studying at uni at the moment, and we're looking at publicity. What do you do to publicise your books, and what does your publisher do?
It's largely up to me these days. Publishers are doing less and less in terms of publicity. They just don't have the resources to do it anymore, so it's more and more up to me. And I do various things, but one thing I found is that school visits work for me. You find out what you do best, and that's one thing that I do best. Other people may be natural social networkers and be able to generate a lot of interest through networking sites. Different ways work, but there is no method that will generally work. There is nothing that you can say is going to work for everyone. You've got to just find something that's a little bit different. I was really pleased with the video clip we did this time because I feel it. Have you seen the video clip?
No, I don't think so.
It's very quirky, quirky in a way that I feel a video clip ought to be. This is the Song of the Slums video clip, and various things like that, like getting my steampunk props and so on. And but different people work in different ways. You just use what you can, and do your absolute maximum, which is hard because. I mean, writers are naturally sort of retiring, sort of secluded beings, sensitive even, you know, we like to kind of just work away in our own worlds and create things, and you can't do that. You've got to get out there, you've got to promote yourself, and I don't think any writer finds it that easy to start with, but it's amazing how many writers learn it.
Yeah. Aurealis, the Twitter account, asks, what is your favourite set opener of all time for music?
Well, I mean, when I used to play my own songs.
Yeah.
That was what I was good at, actually. I was pretty good as a songwriter, a very average singer and a totally hopeless guitarist. It's true. But so I can only sort of name my own songs there. So they didn't ever actually become chart-topping #1, so you wouldn't have heard of them.
Are any of them up on YouTube?
No, I mean, this is the actual period here goes back before YouTube. We're talking about a long while ago. And I'm thinking actually, now I've got my steampunk guitar and I've ordered the amp, which I was hoping to bring down to Melbourne, but it didn't quite arrive in time. So instead of playing acoustic guitars in the past, I now have an electric guitar to play. And I'm going to write a few of the songs that appear in Song of the Slums, because there is one song that you get the lyrics for. There are a lot of songs where you get the titles. And I've been sort of thinking, yeah, I'd like to do that. I'd kind of like to get back into it.
Would be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, it's not that I actually kind of come up with tunes, but I can kind of hear the feel of a song when I've got the title there, and I you know, this song has a particularly slow, heavy driving beat. I'm sort of thinking to myself, yeah, it's that sort of song. So it's kind of asking to be realised in musical terms.
That would be awesome. Yeah. Aurealis also asks, what song did the Rowdies finish with, and did they have an encore?
They've worked in different ways. One song that they tend to fall back on whenever things are going difficult, you know, the audience is sluggish or whatever. Made for Love is their sort of most powerful driving rhythmical song. Yeah, there's a few actually. There's no ending song. I never really set up an ending song, but they did at one stage realise that they needed to have some encores prepared. So they worked on a couple of encores, but yeah, I don't know, a climactic song. It's a bit hard having a climactic song when you're also going to have encores. You've got to kind of have a few climactic songs there.
Yeah, got to build into it.
Yeah.
Is it what is the top item in your bucket list?
To do. There's really just a lot of items. The novels I still want to write, which some are steampunk and some aren't. And you know, I've got a lot of catching up to do. After all those years of writer's block, I've got to just, you know, stay alive long enough to get the things written that I want to. And that I guess would be the #1 priority. I'm living the dream. I'm doing what I always wanted to do. I don't really want to do anything else, and I don't feel any need to climb Mount Everest or anything like that.
What are you working on at the moment? Are you working on your next novel?
Well, I am working on a steampunk idea, and I'm also working on a really long project, which is a big fantasy novel, the adult fantasy. So that's probably not going to be my next novel. It'll take quite a while to finish it. But I suppose if you want the the biggest bucket in the bucket list, that would be the biggest bucket.
So the adult fantasy novel is your bucket list, and you're writing another steampunk novel. Is your steampunk novel YA or different area?
Different area, and YA, yeah, yeah. I mean, I've always found that the kind of stuff I write works pretty well equally from, you know, young kids through to adults, through to seniors even. I mean, like it really works for a lot of people because fantasy doesn't have those inbuilt distinctions. You know what I mean? Like the realistic novel, what interests a 13-year-old isn't going to be what interests a 17-year-old. But with fantasy, that doesn't apply in the same kind of way. And so what I write is marketed as YA. I don't actually think of it as YA. I've never written in my own mind a YA novel. It's just that I've written novels with young characters, so they become YA. Yeah,
and without sex or drugs, that kind of makes it a lot more. It opens up the age group a lot.
Yeah, a sort of limited degree of sort of sex is allowed, but nothing too explicit. But no, yeah.
Well, it depends, because if you're aiming at the older end of YA, that can be quite explicit.
It can be quite explicit. Yeah. There's very little that's actually off limits. But there was an earlier novel of mine called Feminine the Angel, which I originally wrote as an adult novel, which had quite a lot of sex in it. And I decided to change it into YA, partly because I thought it would have more chance of publication, but also because the sex wasn't really that successful. You know, it was a way of kind of removing the sex scenes because they weren't really very good sex scenes. Hopefully, some of the slums where it gets a little bit sexy is much better.
Well, one of the things that I keep, you know, asking when it comes to, you know, novels with a lot of sex in it is why. Now, you've got the novels that are erotic romances, so obviously they're going to have a lot of sex. That's that genre. But if it's not actually an erotic romance, then is the sex actually serving a purpose, or is it distracting from the plot?
Yeah. I mean, you can't beat sexual tension. I mean, that is a real sort of strong thing. It's very strong in Song of the Slums. So, I mean, because the relationship between Asta and Vel is so important, there's going to be quite a lot of that. But
it's a romance.
Yeah, I mean, really, actual sort of sexual description isn't very interesting. It's only the build-up that's interesting.
The sexual description is just so much plumbing after the event.
Right, okay. And you can't put the plumbing in a YA novel anyway, and I don't actually miss it very much. It's the build-up, it's the potential, the sort of the, I don't know, the sort of the erotic kind of experience. It doesn't actually need things to happen. It doesn't need sort of physical realisation in a sense. I mean, the old sort of scene where they vanished off stage at the end of the last chapter was, you know, they knew what they were doing, really.
Yeah, well, it's kind of the philosophy of the Japanese geishas as well. It's not what's shown, it's what's hidden.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Less is more.
Well, I mean, supposedly in Japan, nakedness really isn't very erotic at all. It's being clothed that is much more suggestive.
Yeah. It's a different way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Well, we got into a heavy topic just before the end. So what are your plans for the future?
To spend another at least a month and a half promoting, touring the book, doing school visits.
That's not all in Victoria, is it?
Oh no. Victoria will basically be this week and the next 2 weeks, but also visiting the other states. Then I want to do some more work on the long-term project, the adult fantasy I was talking about. I've got a couple of stories that I need to write even before that, and see where the next steampunk idea takes me. There's always a lot of irons in the fire. I mean, I'm never short of things I want to do. It's actually finding the time to do them all, and I guess I've sort of learned to narrow down a bit. I mean, there were a million things I wanted to do in life. Now I'm down to just a few different kinds of novels.
So do you find that the planning and the developing is kind of ticking away at the back of your mind while you're off doing all this other stuff, the promotions, the school tours and stuff?
Yeah, always. I mean, it's always happening back there. I mean, just driving down to Melbourne from Sydney, these couple of stories. Yeah, I drove. I have to because of the stuff I carry around.
Oh yeah, I suppose. Mm.
Yeah. But
oh, do you have your steampunk guitar here?
yes, do you want to see it?
Can we see it?
Yes.
Oh, please.
Don't get into the seat. But yeah, I mean, I'd been sort of worried about what I was going to do with these two stories, and suddenly they just burst forth as I was driving down. And often how it happens, you sort of you just set the thoughts in the back of your mind and let them kind of stir over and mull and churn around, and then kind of take off the lid a few weeks, months later, and there they are.
I suppose that's one of the advantages of driving, because you're doing something but it's not taking up a lot of brain space.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, I think you can be doing something completely different, and I mean, the only time I've ever really managed to do two totally different kinds of writing was when I was finishing off an academic book and writing probably the second science fiction novel for Henry Macmillan. But I could sort of go from one to the other because there was no sort of overlap. And I think it's a good thing to actually do something completely different. Yeah. And kind of almost like, cleansing the palate, cleansing the mind.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Oh, great. Can we see the guitar?
Okay. Oh, it's getting ready to
perhaps if I turn on the flash.
Yeah, the steampunk guitar was created by Lewis Morley, and he's a very talented guy who's worked on movies like The Hobbit recently, and the Star Wars movies, and Wolverine coming up, and he's found it a little bit frustrating lately because nowadays movie design is so much done by computers, and they kind of tell him what they want him to create rather than giving him free flow and free rein. And I just said to him, create a steampunk guitar. And he used his imagination, and look at the product. I mean, it's amazing what he came up with. So, yeah, there's one creative guy.
It's amazing. Well, thank you very much for talking to Dark Matter.
Well, thanks very much, Nalini. It's been a pleasure.